Kael Voren was running late again, which was becoming something of a personal tradition. The corridor curved ahead of him in that particular way that made every orbital station feel like the inside of a massive wheel, which, he supposed, was exactly what it was. Terminus Gate had been spinning above Verath 7 for nearly 2 centuries now, a monument to the optimistic notion that 17 different species could occupy the same rotating metal cylinder without killing each other. Most days the notion held. Most days. His boots clicked against the polished floor as he hurried toward the assembly chamber, passing display panels that cycled through news feeds in half a dozen languages he couldn't read and 3 he could. The human section of the station maintained Earth Standard Time out of sheer stubbornness, which meant that, when the Corvani scheduled a session at what they considered a civilized hour, Kael's quarters were still deep in artificial night. His wake system had played those damned Centauri meditation chimes again, the ones that were supposed to ease consciousness into gentle awareness, but actually just made him dream about being trapped in a bell tower. He'd filed 3 complaints about the malfunction. The station's maintenance AI had responded each time with a helpful suggestion that perhaps he should embrace the spiritual opportunity. The assembly chamber doors slid open with a whisper of pressurized air, and Kael slipped inside with what he hoped was quiet dignity. Ambassador Yun Seojin caught his eye from across the human delegation section and raised one elegant eyebrow in an expression that managed to convey disappointment, amusement, and a reminder that they would be discussing this later, all without moving a single other muscle on her face. Kael had been studying under her for 3 months now, and he still hadn't figured out how she did that. He found his seat and activated his translation feed, letting the soft murmur of diplomatic proceedings wash over him in converted syllables. A hegemony trade representative was droning on about tariff adjustments to the outer rim shipping lanes, the kind of economic minutiae that somehow managed to be both critically important and completely incomprehensible. Kael let his attention drift, as it often did during these sessions, toward the observation gallery at the chamber's far end. The gallery was a masterwork of engineering, a vast curved window that looked out upon Verath 7's swirling atmosphere. The gas giant filled the view like a god's eye, bands of amber and rust and deep burgundy spiraling around each other in storms that had been raging since before humanity had discovered fire. During session recesses, delegates would gather there to admire the view, to conduct the informal negotiations that often mattered more than the formal ones, to see and be seen in the endless performance of interstellar politics. She stood apart from all of it. Kael noticed her the way one notices a gap in a crowd, an absence that somehow drew the eye more than any presence could. She was tall, slender, with skin that carried a soft blue luminescence, as if starlight had settled just beneath her surface and decided to stay. Her hair was pale blonde, falling past her shoulders in waves that caught the reflected glow of the gas giant's storms. But it was her ears that marked her unmistakably, long and elegantly pointed, rising through her hair like the fins of some graceful sea creature. Aethysian. Even from across the chamber, Kael could see the careful distance other delegates maintained around her, the way bodies shifted and trajectories changed to avoid passing too close. A Corvani trade minister approached the observation windows, saw her standing there, and performed an elaborate redirect that probably added 30 seconds to his walk. 2 hegemony observers exchanged glances and whispered something that made them both laugh, their eyes cutting toward her with the casual cruelty of those who knew they would never face consequences for their contempt. The woman did not react. Her gaze remained fixed on the storms below, her posture straight and still, as if she had long ago learned to turn herself to stone when the whispers began. Voren. Ambassador Yun's voice was soft but carried the particular sharpness she reserved for junior diplomats who had been caught not paying attention. The hegemony delegate is asking about our position on the shipping lane amendments. Kael snapped back to the proceedings, fumbling for his data tablet. Our position is, consistent with the preliminary framework established in the Meridian Accords, with appropriate adjustments for current market conditions. It was a nothing answer, the diplomatic equivalent of clearing one's throat, but it bought him time to pull up the relevant briefing documents. Ambassador Yun's expression suggested she knew exactly what he had done and was filing it away for later discussion. The hegemony delegate seemed satisfied, or at least uninterested in pressing further, and the session moved on to the next agenda item. But Kael's eyes kept drifting back to the observation gallery, to the woman who stood alone at the center of all that careful emptiness. The session broke for recess, and Kael found himself walking toward the gallery before he had consciously decided to do so. Ambassador Yun intercepted him with the practiced ease of someone who had been managing wayward diplomats for decades. "A word, Voren." They stepped into a quiet alcove near the refreshment stations, where the soft hum of the station's recycling systems provided cover for private conversation. Yun's face was carefully neutral, but her eyes held a warning. "I noticed where your attention was during the tariff discussion." Kael opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. Lying to Ambassador Yun was both pointless and insulting, and she deserved better than either. "The Aethisian delegate," he said instead. "I was just curious why she stands apart like that." "She stands apart because everyone else has moved away." Yun's voice was flat, stating fact without judgment. "Her name is Lyshara. She is the last accredited Aethisian representative to any major station, and she holds that position only because of a technicality in Terminus Gate's founding charter." "Do you know the history?" "The Varus collapse," Kael said. 50 years ago, a plague that killed millions across 3 systems. And the Aethysians were blamed." Yun nodded. "Their genetic research programs, their unusual biology, all of it made them convenient scapegoats. Their world was quarantined, their diplomatic status revoked everywhere except here, and their people scattered as refugees. Unwelcome everywhere they fled." She paused, and something that might have been compassion flickered briefly across her features before disappearing behind the mask of professional detachment. She files reports that no one reads. She attends sessions where no one acknowledges her presence. She maintains the fiction of relevance because the alternative is admitting that her people have been erased. Kael searched for the right word and couldn't find it. That's not right. Many things in the galaxy are not right, Voren. Our job is to navigate them without making them worse. Yun placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of something approaching warmth. "I'm telling you this not because I want you to do something, but because I want you to understand why you shouldn't. Getting involved with that situation will not help her, and it will certainly damage you. The hegemony worlds, the compact factions, they watch for anyone who shows sympathy toward Aethysians. It marks you as unreliable at best, contaminated at worst." "Contaminated," Kael repeated. The word tasted sour in his mouth. "I don't make the rules, I simply ensure we survive them." Yun removed her hand and stepped back, the professional distance restored. "The session resumes in 10 minutes. Please try to pay attention to the agricultural import discussions. They're actually quite important." She walked away, leaving Kael alone with his thoughts and the soft hum of the station around him. He looked back toward the observation gallery. Lyshara remained at the window, her reflection ghosting across the glass, superimposed over the storms of Varath 7. As he watched, a small group of delegates passed behind her, their laughter just loud enough to carry. One of them said something that made the others snicker, their eyes sliding toward her and away again with practiced disdain. Lyshara's expression did not change. Her posture did not shift. But Kael saw her hands, clasped behind her back, tighten almost imperceptibly. He should go back to his seat. He should review the agricultural briefings. He should do exactly what Ambassador Yun had advised and keep his distance from a situation that could only hurt his career. Instead, he stood in the alcove and watched the woman who had learned to be invisible, and wondered what it cost her to maintain that stillness while the galaxy looked through her like she was already gone. The botanical garden occupied a small section of the station's environmental ring, a carefully maintained pocket of green in an otherwise metal world. Humans had insisted on its inclusion during Terminus Gate's construction, arguing that their species required regular exposure to living plants for psychological stability. The Corvani had found this requirement amusing, the hegemony representatives had found it wasteful, and the station's architects had ultimately tucked the garden into a curved alcove near the water reclamation systems, where the humidity could serve double duty. Kael had discovered the reading alcove on his second week aboard, a small bench nestled between a stand of ferns and an artificial stream that burbled with recycled water. The sound was meant to be soothing, though it mostly made him need to use the facilities more often than was strictly dignified. Still, it was quiet here, removed from the constant hum of diplomatic activity, and he had claimed it as his own personal sanctuary for the consumption of terrible mystery novels that he would never admit to reading in public. He was 3 chapters into Murder on the Meridian Express when he realized he was not alone. Lyshara sat on the opposite end of the alcove, partially hidden by a cascade of hanging vines that the garden's maintenance systems had allowed to grow slightly wild. She held a cup of something steaming between her hands, her attention fixed on a data tablet propped against her knee. In the soft green light of the garden, her blue skin seemed almost to glow, and her long ears twitched occasionally as she read, small movements that Kael found oddly fascinating. He should leave. He knew he should leave. Ambassador Yun's warning echoed in his mind, all those sensible words about careers and contamination and the wisdom of keeping distance. His data tablet chose that moment to slip from his fingers and clatter against the deck with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the garden's quiet. Lyshara looked up. Kael lunged for the tablet, miscalculated the angle, and knocked his elbow against the bench in a way that sent a shock of pain up his arm. He grabbed the tablet with his other hand, tried to straighten up too quickly, and bumped his head against a low-hanging fern frond that deposited a small shower of condensation down the back of his neck. "I'm sorry," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for. The tablet, the noise, the water now trickling beneath his collar, his general existence in this moment. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I was just reading and my tablet slipped and I should probably go. I'm very sorry for the interruption. This is clearly your space. I didn't realize anyone else came here. Not that you shouldn't be here. You have every right to be here. I just meant that I usually have this alcove to myself and—" "You have been apologizing for approximately 90 seconds, Lyshara observed. Her voice was calm, carrying a slight musical quality that human vocal cords could never quite replicate, without pause or apparent need for breath. Is this a common human social ritual? Kael's mouth opened, closed, and then surprised him entirely by producing something that was almost a laugh. No, it's a common Kael Voren social ritual. I have a talent for making simple situations unnecessarily complicated. A useful skill for a diplomat. There was something in her tone that might have been humor, though her expression remained carefully neutral. You are from the human delegation. I have seen you in the assembly chamber. Kael Voren, junior attaché, professional meeting attender and apparently amateur acrobat. He gestured vaguely at the scene of his recent gracelessness. I really am sorry about the noise, and the falling, and the extended apology about the falling. Lyshara tilted her head slightly, a gesture that made her long ears catch the light. Human social rituals are remarkably cardiovascular. The observation was so unexpected, so perfectly dry in its delivery, that Kael found himself laughing again. Genuinely this time, not the nervous sound of social discomfort, but something warmer. Lyshara's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight softening around her eyes that might have been surprise. "I should go," Kael said, because it was true and because Ambassador Yun's voice was still echoing warnings in the back of his mind. "You do not have to." Lyshara's words came quickly, then seemed to catch her off guard. She looked away, toward the artificial stream. "I only meant that the alcove is large enough for two, if you wish to continue your reading." Kael hesitated. Every sensible instinct told him to leave, to maintain the careful distance that station politics demanded. But there was something in the way she had spoken, something that sounded almost like loneliness wearing the mask of indifference. He sat back down on his end of the bench. They read in silence for nearly an hour, the only sounds the burbling of the stream and the occasional rustle of fern fronds in the garden's artificial breeze. It should have been awkward, sharing space with a woman he had only just met, a woman his superiors had explicitly warned him against. Instead, it felt strangely comfortable, like two people who had agreed without words that sometimes the best company was the kind that didn't require conversation. When Kael finally rose to leave, Lyshara spoke without looking up from her tablet. "The garden is pleasant at this hour. I come here often." It was not an invitation, not exactly, but it was something close to one, an acknowledgement that his presence had not been unwelcome. "So do I," Kael said. "Perhaps we will be awkwardly silent together again sometime." He thought he saw the corner of her mouth twitch just slightly before he turned and walked away. The following station week established a pattern. Kael would arrive at the garden during the quiet hours between sessions, and more often than not, Lyshara would already be there. They spoke little at first, exchanging only small pleasantries before retreating into their respective reading. But gradually, the silences grew shorter and the conversations longer. She asked about Earth, a world she had only seen in archival images. He described the oceans, the way sunlight moved differently through atmosphere than through station viewports, the strange sensation of wind against skin. She listened with an intensity that made him realize how rarely anyone spoke to her about ordinary things, how starved she must be for simple conversation that did not revolve around her status as a pariah. In turn, she told him about Aethys, not the political history, not the accusations and quarantines, but the small details. The way bioluminescent forests lit up during the long nights. The taste of a fruit that had no human equivalent, sweet and sharp and somehow sad. The sound of her mother's voice singing old songs that Lyshara was beginning to forget. "I have been here for 6 years, she said one afternoon, her gaze distant. 6 years of attending sessions where no one acknowledges my presence, filing reports that disappear into administrative systems, maintaining the fiction that my people still have a voice in galactic affairs." She paused. "Sometimes I wonder why I continue." "Why do you?" Kael asked. Lyshara turned to look at him, and for a moment her careful composure slipped, revealing something raw beneath. "Because the observation deck has the best view of the gas giant's northern storms, and I refuse to let small minds deprive me of good weather." Kael smiled, recognizing the deflection for what it was, but he did not press further. Some truths needed time to emerge on their own. The incident in the transport pod happened 3 days later. Kael was returning from a supply meeting when he rounded a corner and found Lyshara standing very still outside pod station 7. A Corvani delegate stood in the pod's entrance, his scaled face twisted with contempt. "I will not share transport with plague carrier," the delegate was saying, his voice loud enough to carry down the corridor. "Station security should remove this contamination from public areas." The assembly chamber hummed with a tension Kael could feel against his skin, electric and wrong. He had arrived early for once, his wake system having apparently decided that today of all days was the moment to finally function correctly. The irony was not lost on him. 3 months of fighting those damned meditation chimes, and the universe chose to grant him punctuality on the morning everything was about to fall apart. Ambassador Yun had called him to her office at station dawn. her face carrying the particular stillness that Kael had learned to associate with very bad news delivered in very calm tones. She had handed him a data tablet displaying the session's agenda, and he had read it 3 times before the words truly registered. Resolution 7742. Emergency motion for the immediate revocation of Aethisian access rights to Terminus Gate, sponsored by the Purity Compact, scheduled for full assembly vote. They've been building toward this for months, Yun had said. The compact has been quietly gathering support among the hegemony worlds, trading favors, making promises. They have the votes, Voren. This will pass. Kael had stared at the tablet, his coffee growing cold in his hand. There must be something we can do. File an objection. Invoke charter protections, something. Humanity has no standing to object. We are not party to the original Aethisian Accords, and involving ourselves would damage relationships we have spent decades building. Yun's voice had been gentle, which somehow made it worse. I know this is difficult, but our position must be neutrality, complete and visible neutrality. Do you understand? He had nodded, because what else could he do? And then he had come to the assembly chamber and taken his seat among the human delegation, and watched as the room filled with representatives who would soon vote to exile a woman, whose only crime was being born to the wrong species. Lyshara stood at her usual position near the observation windows. Today, for the first time since Kael had known her, she was not looking at the storms. Her gaze moved slowly across the chamber, taking in the delegates who would decide her fate, the faces that refused to meet her eyes. Her expression was calm, composed, utterly unreadable, but Kael had spent enough hours in her company to notice the small things. The way her hands were clasped too tightly behind her back, the slight tension in her shoulders, the absolute stillness of her long ears, held rigid when they would normally shift and turn with her attention. She knew what was coming. She had probably known before anyone told her, had probably felt it in the changed quality of the whispers, the way the careful distance around her had grown just a little wider. And she had come anyway, because she had spent 6 years refusing to let them erase her, and she would not start now. The session was called to order. Kael watched the procedural rituals unfold with a growing sense of unreality, the formal phrases and diplomatic courtesies that would serve as prelude to an act of calculated cruelty. A compact spokesperson rose to present the resolution, a hegemony delegate whose name Kael had never bothered to learn and now wished he could forget. The continued presence of Aethisian elements on this station represents an unacceptable biosecurity risk, the delegate began, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone who knew the outcome was already decided. The genetic instability of their species, well documented in the aftermath of the Varus collapse, poses a threat to every being aboard Terminus Gate. We have tolerated this risk for too long out of misguided compassion. It is time to prioritize the safety of the many over the comfort of the few. Kael's hands tightened on his armrests. Beside him, Ambassador Yun sat perfectly still, her expression revealing nothing. The speech continued, each word another stone in a wall being built around a woman who had done nothing wrong. The delegate spoke of plague vectors and genetic contamination, of the millions who had died in the Varus collapse, and the ongoing threat that Aethisian biology represented. He invoked fear with the practiced ease of a man who had learned that fear was the simplest tool for moving crowds. And around the chamber, heads nodded and murmurs of agreement rippled through delegations that had already made their calculations. Lyshara did not move. She stood at the observation windows like a statue carved from blue stone, listening to herself being described as a contagion, as a mistake of evolution, as a threat to civilized space. The storms of Vareth 7 swirled behind her, indifferent to the small cruelties unfolding in their shadow. The vote was called. One by one, delegations registered their positions, the numbers climbing on the display screens with mechanical precision. In favor, in favor, in favor. A few abstentions scattered among the count like small acts of cowardice dressed as principle. The human delegation abstained, as Ambassador Yun had promised, their neutrality a careful nothing that changed nothing. Kael watched Lyshara's face as the final tally appeared. Watched the moment she understood that this place, the last place in the galaxy where she had legal standing, was closing its doors against her. Her expression did not change. Her posture did not shift, but something behind her eyes went quiet, like a light being slowly dimmed. He should stay in his seat. He knew he should stay in his seat. Ambassador Yun's words echoed in his mind, all those sensible warnings about careers and positions and the wisdom of keeping distance. The vote was done. The resolution had passed. There was nothing he could do that would change the outcome, nothing that would not cost him everything he had worked to build. And yet, he thought of the garden, of afternoons spent in comfortable silence with a woman who had learned to be invisible. He thought of her voice describing forests that glowed in the darkness, of a mother's songs being slowly forgotten, of 6 years spent maintaining a fiction of relevance while the galaxy looked through her like glass. He thought of her standing outside the transport pod, her hands trembling as she stepped away from a man who had called her contamination, and the careful way she had composed her face afterward, as if absorbing cruelty was simply another skill she had been forced to master. He thought of all the times he had done the sensible thing, the careful thing, the thing that protected his position and preserved his prospects. And he thought of how empty those prospects would feel if he sat here now and let this moment pass in silence. Kael Voren rose from his seat. The movement drew eyes. Delegates turned, confused by this breach of protocol, this junior human attaché standing when the session had not been recessed. Ambassador Yun's sharp intake of breath was audible even from several seats away. Kael did not look at her. He could not afford to see her face right now. He walked across the chamber floor. The distance between the human delegation section and the observation windows seemed to stretch forever, each step carrying him further from everything safe and sensible and expected. His heartbeat was very loud in his ears. His legs felt strange, disconnected, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. Lyshara watched him approach. Her long ears had gone completely still, rigid with tension or confusion or something Kael could not name. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the explanation that he was not sure he could give. He stopped in front of her. The entire chamber had gone silent, thousands of eyes fixed on this inexplicable scene, recording devices capturing every detail for broadcasts that would reach a dozen worlds. Kael reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cool against his, trembling almost imperceptibly. Her eyes widened, those beautiful alien eyes that had learned to hide so much, and for a moment she looked at him with an expression of such profound shock that Kael felt his chest ache with the weight of it. He turned to face the chamber, her hands still clasped in his, and spoke in a voice that did not shake nearly as much as he had expected. "Under Article 7 of the Human Neutral Territories Compact," he said, "I extend personal diplomatic asylum to Lyshara of Aethys. She is under my protection. Any action against her will be considered an action against the human diplomatic mission." The silence that followed was absolute. Then it shattered into chaos, voices rising in outrage and confusion, delegates shouting for clarification, security personnel moving uncertainly toward the chamber floor. Ambassador Yun had risen from her seat, her face a mask of controlled fury that Kael knew he would be answering for very soon. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the hand in his, no longer trembling. What mattered was Lyshara's voice, soft enough that only he could hear it over the growing tumult. "Why?" she asked. Kael looked at her, at this woman who had stood alone for so long, and found that the answer was simpler than he had expected. Because someone should have done this years ago. The quarters they had assigned him for confinement were, Kael had to admit, significantly nicer than his regular accommodations. There was a certain irony in being punished with an upgrade, though he suspected the improved furnishings had less to do with comfort and more to do with the steady stream of investigators, officials, and deeply unhappy superiors who had been cycling through his door for the past 3 days. Apparently, the station's administrative systems had decided that if humanity's diplomatic reputation was going to implode, it should at least implode in a room with a decent viewport. Ambassador Yun had been the first to visit, arriving within an hour of the assembly incident with an expression that could have frozen the atmosphere off a gas giant. She had stood in the center of his quarters for a long moment, saying nothing, and Kael had found himself wishing she would simply yell. The silence was infinitely worse. "Do you have any idea," she had finally said, her voice terrifyingly calm, "what you have done?" Kael had considered several responses. He had settled on the truth. Yes. Earth's colonial government is demanding an explanation. The hegemony is threatening to suspend all pending trade negotiations. The Purity Compact is calling for your immediate arrest and extradition. Yun's hands had been clasped behind her back, her posture rigid with control. Your diplomatic credentials are under review. Your career, such as it was, is almost certainly over. And for what? A gesture. A moment of sentiment that will change nothing. It changed something for her, Kael had said quietly. Yun had stared at him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. Then she had turned and walked out without another word. She had not returned since. The other visitors had been less memorable. Station security officials asking the same questions in slightly different configurations. Legal analysts explaining the various ways his actions could be interpreted under competing jurisdictional frameworks. A communications officer informing him that 17 different news services had requested interviews, all of which had been declined on his behalf. The bureaucratic machinery of consequences grinding forward with methodical precision. Through it all, Kael found himself thinking about Lyshara's hand in his, the coolness of her fingers, the moment her trembling had stopped. On the 4th day, the door chimed with a visitor he had not expected. Lyshara stood in the corridor outside his quarters, flanked by 2 station security officers who looked deeply uncomfortable with their assignment. Her expression was carefully composed, but her long ears were angled slightly backward in what Kael had learned to recognize as uncertainty. "They told me I could not see you," she said. "I explained that I would wait in the corridor until they changed their minds. It took 7 hours, but administrative persistence is something of an Aethisian specialty." Kael felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had not realized he was carrying. 7 hours. "I brought reading material." She held up a data tablet. "Also, I believe one of the security officers developed a respiratory condition from the stress. I feel somewhat responsible." The guards escorted her inside, then took up positions near the door with the air of people who had been given confusing orders and were choosing to interpret them as loosely as possible. Lyshara moved to the viewport, looking out at the familiar swirl of Varath's 7 storms, and Kael was struck by how different she seemed in this space. In the assembly chamber in the garden, she had always carried herself with a careful stillness, a containment that spoke of years spent making herself smaller. Here, something in her posture had shifted, not relaxed exactly, but present in a way she had not been before. "You should not have done it," she said, still facing the viewport. "What you did in that chamber, you should not have done it." "Probably not," Kael agreed. "Your career is ruined. Your position is compromised. You have made yourself a target for people who would happily destroy you simply to prove a point." Her voice was tight. "And for what?" "I did not ask for your protection. I did not want to become a symbol." "I know." She turned then, and he saw that her composure had cracked, revealing something raw beneath. "You made me visible. I spent years learning how to be invisible, how to exist in the spaces between their contempt, and you made me visible in front of the entire station. Do you understand what that means? Every moment now, every breath, I am being watched, judged, measured against whatever narrative they choose to construct." Kael moved toward her slowly, carefully, the way one might approach a wounded creature. "I'm sorry. I didn't think about what it would mean for you. I only thought about what it would mean if I did nothing. That is not good enough. Her voice broke slightly. That is not good enough, and I am so angry with you, and I cannot stop being grateful, and I do not know what to do with either of those things. They stood in silence for a moment, the viewport casting them both in the amber light of the gas giant storms. Somewhere beyond the walls, the station continued its slow rotation, indifferent to the small dramas unfolding within its metal skin. In my culture, Lyshara said finally, her voice quieter now, the touching of hands carries significance. It is an act of bonding, of trust extended across the barrier of individual consciousness. She looked down at her own hands, clasped in front of her. When you took my hand in that chamber, you did not know this, but your people watched, and my people will eventually learn, and the gesture will carry weight you did not intend. Kael absorbed this, turning it over in his mind. Is that bad? It is complicated. A ghost of something that might have been humor crossed her features. Everything is complicated now. The door chimed again. One of the security officers moved to answer it, and a moment later, a woman Kael did not recognize stepped into the quarters. She was human, middle-aged, with the kind of practical bearing that suggested a life spent in laboratories rather than diplomatic chambers. Her eyes moved quickly around the room, assessing, cataloging, before settling on Lyshara with an expression of carefully controlled intensity. "Dr. Amara Os," she said, extending a hand first to Lyshara, then to Kael. "Xenobiologist, 15 years with the Outer Systems Research Initiative, currently on extended sabbatical that absolutely nobody is supposed to know about." She smiled, but it did not quite reach her eyes. "I have been trying to reach you, Kael Voren, for approximately 18 hours. Your communications are being monitored, your visitors are being screened, and I had to claim I was delivering a medical consultation just to get through the door. So we should probably talk quickly." Kael exchanged a glance with Lyshara. "Talk about what?" "Dr. Os," I reached into her jacket and produced a data chip, holding it up like a small treasure. "The Varus collapse, what really happened, and why everything you think you know about Aethisian biology is a lie designed to cover up the worst crime in modern galactic history." The room seemed to contract around those words. Lyshara had gone very still, her long ears rigid with attention. "I have spent 6 years gathering evidence," Os I continued, her voice dropping. "Research data, classified communications, testimony from witnesses who were subsequently discredited or disappeared. The plague that killed millions across 3 systems was not caused by Aethisian genetic contamination. It was a bioweapon, developed by a hegemony Black Ops program, deployed deliberately, and then blamed on the most convenient scapegoat they could find." Kael felt the floor shift beneath him, though the station's rotation had not changed. "You're saying the Aethysians were framed." "I'm saying they were sacrificed." Osai's expression hardened. 50 years of persecution based on a lie. An entire species turned into pariahs because they were useful victims. She looked at Lyshara, something like grief in her eyes. "I am so sorry. I have wanted to bring this forward for years, but I needed someone with diplomatic standing willing to present it, someone willing to risk everything." She turned back to Kael, and her meaning was clear. "You've already destroyed your career. Would you like to make it count for something?" The assembly chamber had never been so full. Every seat was occupied, every viewing gallery packed with bodies, and still more watched through the station's broadcast network. The proceedings transmitted to 17 worlds and countless ships scattered across the dark between stars. Kael stood at the speaker's podium, a position he had never imagined occupying, and felt the weight of all those watching eyes pressing against his skin. 3 days had passed since Dr. Os had appeared in his quarters with her data chip and her accusations. 3 days of verification, of scrambling through diplomatic channels, of convincing station officials that the evidence deserved a hearing. Ambassador Yun had opposed him at first, her arguments sharp and practical, outlining every way this could fail and every consequence that would follow. But something had shifted in her expression when she reviewed the data herself, something that looked almost like shame. "If this is true," she had said quietly, "then we have been complicit in a great wrong." "It is true," Kael had replied, "and we can make it right." Now he stood before the assembled delegates, the evidence compiled on the screens behind him, and prepared to tear down 50 years of carefully constructed lies. Lyshara sat in the observation gallery, no longer at the windows but in a seat among the delegations, her presence a silent declaration that she would not be pushed to the margins any longer. Dr. Osai sat beside her, data tablet ready, prepared to answer the technical questions that would inevitably follow. Kael cleared his throat and began. He spoke of the Varus collapse, not as it had been presented in official histories, but as the evidence revealed it to be. He showed the classified communications between hegemony military officials discussing the deployment of an experimental pathogen. He displayed the research data that proved the plague's genetic signature was incompatible with Aethisian biology. He presented testimony from witnesses who had been silenced, threatened, or simply erased from the record. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, constructing an undeniable picture of deliberate atrocity and systematic deception. The chamber erupted multiple times. Hegemony delegates shouted objections, demanding the proceedings be halted, claiming the evidence was fabricated. Purity compact representatives walked out in protest, their departure captured by every recording device in the room. But the station's independent verification systems confirmed each document's authenticity, and the truth, once spoken, could not be unspoken. Kael felt strangely calm throughout it all. He had expected fear, expected the nervous trembling that had accompanied his walk across the chamber floor days earlier. Instead, there was only a quiet certainty, a sense of finally standing in the place he was meant to be. When he finished presenting the evidence, a silence fell over the chamber. It was not the hostile silence of the expulsion vote, not the uncomfortable silence of delegates avoiding an inconvenient truth. It was the silence of people confronting something they could not ignore, could not explain away, could not pretend had not happened. Then Lyshara rose from her seat. She walked to the speaker's podium, her movement fluid and unhurried, her long ears catching the light as she turned to face the assembly. Kael stepped aside to give her the floor, and she stood there for a moment, looking out at the delegates who had spent years refusing to acknowledge her existence. "I did not come here to demand apology," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. "I did not come here to seek vengeance or to catalog the countless ways your fear and hatred have wounded my people. I came here because I still believe that truth matters, that acknowledgement matters, that the first step toward healing is simply being seen." She paused, and Kael watched her gather herself, watched the effort it took to speak these words to an audience that had treated her as invisible for so long. "My world is quarantined. My people are scattered across the galaxy, unwelcome wherever they go, defined by an accusation that was never true. We have lost a generation to exile. We have lost our songs, our stories, the threads of culture that connect us to our past. You cannot give us back what was taken. No resolution, no formal acknowledgement, no diplomatic gesture can restore what 50 years of persecution has destroyed." Her voice softened but did not weaken. "But you can choose differently now. You can look at the evidence before you and accept that you were deceived. You can recognize that my people are not contagions, not threats, not mistakes of evolution. We are simply people, wounded people, grieving people, but people nonetheless. And we deserve to exist without the weight of your false accusations pressing against us." She looked directly at the hegemony delegation, at the empty seats where the Purity Compact representatives had been. "I am not asking you to love us. I am asking you to let us exist. Let us rebuild. Let us prove what we might become when we are not defined by what others have accused us of being." The applause started slowly, from the human delegation, from the young Corvani attaché who who had quietly admitted that someone needed to do something. It spread through the chamber in waves, not universal, not unanimous, but real. Delegates who had voted for expulsion days earlier now rose to their feet, their faces marked with something that might have been shame or might have been the first stirrings of conscience. The vote that followed was not the end of anything. It could not be. The resolution acknowledging the truth of the Varus collapse passed, but Aethys remained quarantined, the political machinery of 50 years not so easily dismantled. Formal inquiries were launched, investigations promised, diplomatic processes initiated that would take years to complete. But the conversation had changed. The lie had been named, and naming it was the first step toward unmaking it. Afterward, when the chamber had emptied and the broadcasts had ended, Kael found Lyshara at the observation windows. She stood in her familiar position, gazing out at the storms of Vareth 7, but something in her posture had shifted. The careful stillness was still there, the composure she had learned through years of endurance, but beneath it was something new, something that looked almost like hope. Ambassador Yun informed me that my diplomatic credentials have been reinstated, Kael said, moving to stand beside her. Apparently, exposing a 50-year cover-up counts as sufficient justification for unauthorized asylum declarations. There may also have been some concern about the public relations implications of punishing me now. Lyshara's mouth curved slightly. How convenient that heroism and political expediency occasionally align. I prefer to think of it as the universe finally developing a sense of timing. He paused, looking out at the swirling storms. What happens now? For you, I mean for your people. I do not know. She said the words without fear, without the careful neutrality that had once been her armor. The quarantine will take years to lift, if it lifts at all. My people will remain scattered, will continue to face prejudice from those who refuse to accept the truth. But they will also know that someone spoke for them, that their suffering was acknowledged, that they were seen. She turned to look at him, her alien eyes warm in the amber light. You gave us that. Whatever else happens, you gave us that. Kael felt something tighten in his chest, an emotion he could not quite name. I gave you a gesture. Dr. Os, I gave you the evidence. You gave them something far more important. What is that? A reason to listen. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the storms spiral in their eternal patterns. The station rotated slowly around them, 17 species continuing their endless dance of negotiation and compromise, and somewhere in the corridors beyond, the machinery of justice was beginning its slow, uncertain work. The touching of hands, Lyshara said quietly. In my culture it carries significance. I told you this. You did. I did not tell you everything. She hesitated, her long ears shifting with uncertainty. Among my people, it is not simply an act of trust. It is an offer, an invitation to know someone more deeply than words allow, to share in their joys and sorrows, to walk alongside them through whatever darkness lies ahead. Kael turned to face her fully, understanding dawning slowly. And when I took your hand in that chamber without knowing any of this, you offered something you did not understand, and I accepted it. She met his eyes, and for the first time since he had known her, she let him see everything. The grief, the hope, the fear, the longing, all of it laid bare. I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid that knowing would change things between us. It does change things, Kael said. Then, carefully, deliberately, he reached out and took her hand again. But I think I would like to find out what they change into. Lyshara's fingers curled around his, cool and steady, no longer trembling. Her ears tilted forward, an expression of something that might have been joy. They stood together at the observation windows, two figures silhouetted against the storms of Vareth 7, and let the silence between them speak the words that neither quite knew how to say. Outside, the stars burned on in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of connection unfolding beneath them. But for Kael and Lyshara, in this moment, the universe felt very small indeed, small enough to hold in the space between two joined hands.